If you run with big ideas and then you're true to those ideas and get a chance to serve and implement them and do it with passion and conviction, you can move the needle.
Jeb Bush sounding very much like a presidential candidate and then announcing on Facebook he will actively explore a White House run in 2016. And we're back now with the panel. Liz, what do you make of Jeb Bush deciding so early, not necessarily that he's going to run, but kind of running? And do you see his support for legal status for people who are in this country illegally and his support for Common Core educational standards, are those too moderate for the Republican base who will be voting in the GOP primaries?
I think it's fascinating that he made this announcement as early as he did. He's clearly going to be a serious, formidable candidate if he ends up getting in the race fully. His record as governor of Florida is certainly a conservative one, and he certainly is still very popular in Florida. So I think that, you know, the conventional wisdom that you sort of see now forming that he's not a conservative, you know, we'll see. And he's going to have to fight for this and prove himself just like any other nominee would.
But do you think those positions on immigration and education are in some sense disqualifying?
No, I don't believe they're disqualifying. I think that people have to remember, though, that conservative principles, conservatives, you know, are the heart and soul of our party. And we got beat in 2008, we got beat in 2012 in part because we didn't get our voters energized, enthused into the polls. And so whoever is our nominee, whoever is successful in the primaries is going to have to be somebody who really can lead and inspire and energize the conservative base of our party. And, you know, we'll see what happens. But I think, you know, Jeb is going to have to fight for this just like every other candidate will. I think it's interesting to plant the flag this early and to sort of feel the excitement of the primary season beginning.
Well, we're certainly excited in the Sunday talk shows, Judy. Planting the flag so early is, and obviously there's 2 years, literally, is Jeb Bush now the front runner for the nomination?
Oh, I don't think you can say anybody's the front runner. I mean, you may be able to say Hillary Clinton's the front runner on the Democratic side. I think it's much more wide open than that on the Republican side. By the way, on these 2 issues that you were just asking Liz about, it's so interesting because if those are the 2 issues that are defining whether he is conservative enough, those both had their roots in his brother's presidency. Certainly immigration reform and then the Common Core, the debate over educational standards, had its roots in No Child Left Behind and what came out of that and the educational standards argument that came out of that. But who knows whether he's the front runner? We will see. But it's clear that he is speeding the process up. I can guarantee you a number of Republicans are not spending this holiday just toasting marshmallows with the family around the Christmas fireplace. They're sitting there thinking, are we going to go or not? And it's sped up the timetable. Chris Christie, you know, has to be thinking about it. And
yeah, there's money, there's organizers, there's a whole infrastructure before you actually announce, and Jeb Bush is obviously going to soak a lot of that up. George, 2 things. One, I'd love your thoughts on Bush, but I also want to ask you about really what has been a surprisingly nasty flap this week between Senators Rand Paul and Marco Rubio over the question of President Obama's opening to Cuba. After Rand Paul said he supported it, Rubio said, like many people, Paul, has no idea what he's talking about. Then Rand Paul fired back. Seems to me Senator Rubio is acting like an isolationist who wants to retreat to our borders and perhaps build a moat. George?
Well, Cuba is a museum of 2 failures, the failure of communism and the failure of our embargo, which made perfect sense in 1961 when it was put in place for the explicit purpose of effecting regime change. Since 1991, with the disappearance of Cuba's patron, the Soviet Union, it has not made any sense at all, as far as I'm concerned. Marco Rubio is right that the president should have struck a better bargain to help the breathtakingly heroic democratic movement in Cuba. On the other hand, he's wrong to say that this confers legitimacy. American public philosophy is clear that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, and that does not exist yet in Cuba. Rand Paul is right that some kind of exposure of Cuba to the culture of America, both our popular culture and the culture of commerce, is apt to be a solvent to the regime. However, Rand Paul does not seem to be, as many of us now are, sadder but wiser about the liberalizing effects of trade, because we tried this with China, we've tried this with Vietnam, and both have shown the compatibility of an open economy and a closed political system.
All right, before I bring in Juan, your thoughts quickly about Jeb Bush?
Well, He has 4 strikes against him: Common Core, immigration, his name, and the big sign on his back that says establishment choice. All that said, he's enormously talented, does his homework. The Republicans have not won the presidency without a Bush on the ticket since 1972. I don't know if they're ready to start again, but I think he's a huge plus to the race.
And if he won, Chris, he'd be the 3rd Bush to be president within 25 years.
Fox News, different subject. Fox News has obtained a letter that Chris Christie has sent to President Clinton. Very interesting, calling on the president to demand that Cuba return convicted cop killer Joanne Chesimard, who's been given safe haven in Cuba since the 1980s. Christie writes to the president, "I urge you to demand the immediate return of Chesimard before any further consideration of restoration of diplomatic relations with the Cuban government." Juan, I mean, this is just an indication. There's a lot of unfinished business and a lot of scar tissue between the U.S. and Cuba.
There's no question about it. And in that letter, Chris Christie refers to her as notorious and a cold-blooded killer. And it's so interesting because if you listen to her, and you know, it's even political in terms of how I speak about her, is she Joanne Chesimard or is she Assate Shakur? She is, by the way, the aunt or godmother of Tupac Shakur, the musician. So she has described herself as someone who is a folk hero. She's become a folk hero and a revolutionary figure in much of Black America. She talks about herself as an escaped slave. But the reality is that she's a convicted murderer. So if you believe...
Who incidentally got out of prison when she was sprung by some of her Confederates.
Correct. People who were members of the Black Liberation Army pulled guns in the prison. So what you've got here is a situation, if you believe in law, you know, you can take sides with the police, you can say this is a racial issue, a black-white issue, especially after what's happened with Michael Brown and Eric Garner, and of course that horrible killing in New York yesterday. But the fact is, if you believe in us, the American people, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, as a country of laws, you've got to say this is a convicted murder and should be brought back to this country. Cuba has 70 U.S. prisoners there that they have designated as political prisoners, and I think Fidel Castro gave her protection, sanctuary, really to give us a thumb in the eye. And so it appeals to all the attitudes in terms of Black America's, you know, love of the revolution and fighting against the white man and all that. But you know what? This is all about Fidel Castro, and he is a despot, in my opinion, and someone who the United States needs to be very clear. Until there are human rights established, until there are political freedoms and freedom of the press established, we should not be playing footsie and shouldn't be sending Christmas cards to Fidel Castro.
I stand with Juan Williams on
I
this.
was going to say, what is in the water here? I don't know if it's a Christmas miracle or whatever, but you two are the hardliners today.
No, you know, I was born in Panama, and my dad had some attitudes about some of these Latin American despots, and so I don't have any
No romanticism about that.
I don't make heroes out of those guys.
All right. Thank you, panel. See you next Sunday. Merry Christmas to all of you.